Welcome to Rusty Nail and Friends, a place where little things long forgotten come quietly to life. In a garden shed, the smallest of friends find the biggest of adventures. So snuggle down and get comfortable, and let the story begin. Springaling springs into action. One warm autumn day, the apples in next door's orchard had slowly turned to glorious colours of amber and scarlet, one by one dropping into the tall grass below the straggly old trees, to be devoured by the wasps. The sun shone through the shed window most afternoons, and Rusty Nail and Sprocket would often settle into their deck chairs and read comics, or just lay back and watch young Pinion and Wingsey playing marbles. Sometimes Pinion would get bored and start teasing the old spider who lived under the flower pot, making Rusty put down her comic and tell him to behave himself. "Remember," she'd shout, "you'll be old yourself one day." However, on this particular occasion, it was something very different that made Rusty and Sprocket sit up with a start. Crash! Bang! A large red apple landed on the bench, sending the old spider scurrying back under the flower pot. "Whatever was that?" shrieked Rusty. "What are you up to now, Pinion?" But Pinion and his friend Wingsey had scurried behind the scrap-box, looking most alarmed. "It was that big apple!" exclaimed Sprocket, pointing along the bench. "It's just fallen through that hole in the roof. It strikes me you're not safe anywhere," he went on. "It's a jolly good job it didn't strike you," replied Rusty with a wry smile. "How can an apple make all that noise?" began Wingsey Nut, peeping from behind the scrap-box. "It sounded more like thunder." Wingsey Nut had such large ears that even a tiny sound was like a thunderclap to him. "It just dropped through that hole in the roof," said Rusty. "Isn't it beautiful?" "And it almost hit me on the head," snapped Sprocket. "Well, it didn't, so stop whinging," replied Rusty, "and think yourself lucky." "Shush, you two," began Wingsey, looking rather puzzled. "I think I can hear a baby crying." "A baby crying?" repeated Rusty. "I can't hear it." "Nor me," said Sprocket, putting his hands behind his ears. "There it is again," insisted Wingsey, "and it's coming from somewhere very close." "From inside this apple," shouted Pinion, who had his ear pressed against it. "I can hear lots of babies crying." Soon everyone, including the two-faced nut, had their faces pressed against the apple. "It's the pips," said Wingsey, "apple pips, and they're very upset because the apple fell into the shed." "Why?" blurted Rusty, looking puzzled. "I think it's a nice shed." "That's because you're not an apple," replied Wingsey. "Apples live in orchards, not sheds." "So what's so special about orchards?" interrupted Sprocket. "As far as I remember, they're just full of grass and old trees." "But then the pips can grow into new trees," replied Wingsey, appearing to be quite knowledgeable about seeds. "Can't you see? That's why they're so upset." "Well, if that's why they're crying," said Rusty thoughtfully, "we must find a way to get them into the orchard." They all agreed that this was a good idea. Even the old spider popped out her head and nodded approval. "How can we do that?" asked the two-faced nut. "The apple looks far too heavy for us to lift." "Only because you're a weakling," replied the nut's sad face. "If we had a key for the shed door, we could roll it out," said Sprocket. "But we haven't," replied Rusty. "Then I know what we can do," blurted the happy face, with a big grin. "We can eat it." "Eat it?" gasped Sprocket. "What, all of it?" "Why not?" continued the nut. "All of it except the pips, of course. I know how to make apple pie, and there's apple tarts and apple pudding, apple fritters, apple chutney, and apple—" "Don't forget apple poodles!" shouted young Pinion. "Oh, don't you start, Pinion," snapped Sprocket. "And you mean apple strudels, not poodles." "Stop talking about cooking," interrupted Rusty. "What about the pips? They're the ones we should be thinking about." "Well," began Sprocket, "the pips live in the core, so if we eat our way to the middle, then we can let the pips out." "And then what do we do?" replied Rusty. "We can't expect baby pips to find their way into the orchard." "Of course we can't," replied Sprocket. "I've already thought about that." Then after a pause he went on, "But if you don't mind, I think I'll keep that bit as a surprise." They began at once cutting slices from the apple, and soon discovered that it was very juicy and sweet. Rusty could fill tumblers with delicious golden juice whenever they were thirsty, just by poking a stick into the soft flesh. Each day Rusty and Sprocket would try cooking another apple recipe, until one morning young Pinion suddenly burst into tears, saying that he never wanted to see or eat another apple ever again. And could he please, he went on, sobbing, have sausages or pancakes for his supper. But Sprocket told him that it was all in a good cause, and he should try to be patient a little longer for the sake of the pips. Nearly another week passed, and each day they could hear the pips' cries growing a little louder. Sometimes they sounded very sad, but most of the time they just squabbled and shouted rude names at each other like spoilt children. Then one afternoon, as Rusty was cutting a large piece of apple she intended to bake for supper, she noticed a tiny brown face peeping through a hole. "Goodness me!" she cried. "Are you a pip?" "Certainly not," replied the face. "I'm a seed." Rusty shouted to Sprocket to come quickly. "Look, it's a pip, I mean a seed," she began. But before she could utter another word, a second face appeared, then a third and a fourth, until she lost count. Soon all the pips began squabbling, pushing and slapping each other as they scrambled to get through the hole. "Now you can stop that at once," shouted Rusty, pointing a finger at one of the large pips. "That's the way, one at a time," said Sprocket, sounding like a schoolmaster. "Now the next." Soon all the pips had climbed from the apple core and were jumping up and down excitedly on the bench. "They seem very happy," said Sprocket. "Yes," replied Wingsey, who turned up just as the pips started singing and dancing round and round in circles. "But why do they have to make such a noise?" "Because they're happy to be free at last," replied Rusty. "Remember, they've been stuck inside that apple core for weeks. I suppose that's why they got so ratty with each other." However, it wasn't very long before the pips got tired of jumping about on the hard bench top and began talking about soft grass and shady orchards. "We heard you say you'd take us to the orchard," blurted one of the pips. "Yes, we did." "And why are we still in this old shed?" shouted the others. "You'll just have to be a little patient," replied Rusty, "and give me a chance to think about it." "Don't forget, Sprocket did say that he had a plan," interrupted Pinion. "Oh, yes, so he did," replied Rusty, looking somewhat relieved. "Remember, Sprocket, you said you had a plan But you wanted to keep it as a surprise. Well, go on, surprise us." "Yes, tell us what the surprise is, Mr. Sprocket," shouted the big Pip. Sprocket looked rather sheepish as all the Pips gathered round him and started shouting, "Come on, Mr. Sprocket, tell us your surprise plan." How he wished he hadn't boasted about having a plan, because at this moment he hadn't the faintest idea of how to get the Pips into the orchard. However, before he had time to say anything, there was a loud pinging sound as Springaling landed on the bench next to him, swinging gently from side to side and quivering all over like a jelly. "Oh, hello, Springaling," said Rusty, who had not seen him for a while. "You're just in time to hear Sprocket tell us his surprise plan." "A surprise plan, did you say? Gosh, that sounds very exciting, Rusty. Whatever can it be?" he went on, bouncing up and down. Springaling didn't have many real friends, and just bounced around on his own, stopping from time to time to say hello and hear the latest gossip. He was once the working part of a little girl's jack-in-a-box, until she grew too old to play with toys. Then one day, broken and discarded, he was thrown in the rubbish skip. How lucky it was that Morris Wainwright happened to be passing at the time, and thought that a large spring from a jack-in-a-box may just come in handy, and that's how Springaling came to be living in the garden shed. Now seeing Springaling suddenly gave Sprocket an idea. "How very fortunate that you decided to visit," began Sprocket, in a matter-of-fact sort of way. "Only I was just about to mention to the others that Springaling may be able to help us, if, of course, he is happy to go along with my plan." "Springaling?" gasped Rusty. "Whatever can Springaling do that we can't? After all, he lives inside the shed the same as the rest of us." "But if he will do his jack-in-a-box game," replied Sprocket, sounding as though this had been his plan all along, "we can set the Pips on his hat and shoot them back through the hole in the shed roof." "Jack-in-a-box box?" quivered Springaling. "You mean like space rockets?" blurted Wingsey. "More like space Pips, if you ask me," Rusty replied, smiling. "Now you just wait a minute," began the big Pip called Mickey, who looked rather concerned about being shot through such a small hole. "Maybe we should wait a little while and see if somebody else can think of a better idea." But after about an hour or so nobody had, apart from young Pinion, who thought that sausages would be nicer than apple pie for supper. "If we don't think of something soon," said Rusty, sounding a little agitated, "someone may just come along and repair the shed roof." "Then it will all be too late," remarked Sprocket. "Yes, and the Pips will just have to live in the shed forever," exclaimed Pinion, "whether they like it or not." Meanwhile Springaling had been thinking about the old days, the joy on the children's faces as he popped out of his box, and how the old toys in the nursery, the wooden soldiers and teddies who were once his friends, would fall about laughing as the little boys sat marbles on his hat and watched him shoot them up to the ceiling. Glancing at the anxious little faces of the Pips, all staring up at him, he said, "If you will trust me and be my friend, I'll play my jack-in-the-box game and send you all safely into the orchard." The Pips started jumping up and down excitedly, clapping their hands and shouting, "Good old Springaling! You can be our bestest friend ever." Rusty and Sprocket stood Springaling directly below the hole, while young Pinion and Wingsey made the other pips all stand in a line, ready to take their turn. Then Rusty asked Springaling to crouch down as low as he could while Sprocket helped Mickey Pip, who had been volunteered to go first, to climb onto Springaling's hat. "Now sit very still, Mickey," said Rusty, before asking Springaling if he was ready. Then she shouted, "Okay, Springaling, now do a jack-in-a-box." After a little quiver he suddenly sprung to his full height, and Mickey Pip, with his hands pressed tightly over his eyes, disappeared through the hole in the shed roof, to the cheers of his excited friends. "Well done, Springaling!" shouted Sprocket. "That was brilliant." "It certainly was," cried Rusty, feeling she ought to give him a big hug. But Springaling was still wobbling, so she decided that it was better not to. Instead, she asked the pips to give him a big clap. "Whose turn next?" shouted Wingsey. But the pips were all scrambling to climb onto Springaling's hat, impatient to get into the apple orchard. "One at a time," he kept shouting, as Springaling kept shooting the happy little pips through the hole, while Pinion and the others stood by the window cheering loudly each time another pip landed in the orchard. The last few pips were standing quietly waiting for their turn when a ladder suddenly appeared outside the window before clattering against the shed. "Is there no peace anywhere?" grumbled the old spider, popping her head from under the flower pot and opening one eye. "If it's not apple pips clapping and singing, or springs pinging, then it's workmen hammering." "Gosh!" gasped Rusty. "So it is! The workmen are here to repair the shed roof." Pippin had just climbed onto Springaling's hat and was frantically waving good-bye when the chap on the ladder slapped a piece of plywood over the hole and shouted at the top of his voice, "Chuck me up an hammer, Fred!" "Oh, no! What do we do now?" gasped Sprocket, glancing first at Rusty and then at Springaling. "Do? What do we do?" shouted Springaling, who was thoroughly enjoying every minute of his jack-in-a-box game. "I will tell you what we jolly well do, my friends. Quick, Pippin, jump down. Balance that big brass weight on my hat," he went on, vibrating all over with excitement, and pointing to a set of old shop scales at the end of the bench. "Brass weight?" gasped Rusty. "Are you sure?" she went on, looking first at the big brass weight and then at the quivering Springaling. Sure, I'm sure," he replied impatiently. Rusty, Sprocket, and Wingsey dragged the large brass weight across the bench. With young Pinion's help they managed to lift it onto Springaling's hat, squashing him almost flat. Only his big toe could be seen poking from under the brim of his hat. "Are you okay?" shouted Sprocket, but the spring just grunted something that sounded a bit like, "What do you think?" "Okay, Springaling, do a jack-in-a-box," they all shouted into his ear. But nothing happened. So they shouted again, and this time the pips joined in. "Do a jack-in-a-box, Springaling." But still nothing happened. The old spider, who'd been watching all this going on and was just waiting for a bit of peace and quiet, shouted, "For goodness sake, tickle his toes with a feather." So they did, and Springaling began to quiver, and the more they tickled the more he quivered. Then, with one enormous ping, Springaling shot to his full height, sending the big brass weight crashing through the hole in the roof, knocking the plywood patch high into the air. The man on the ladder gasped out loud as he tumbled back into the branches of an apple tree before dropping into the long grass below a shower of ripe apples. "Now's our chance!" boomed Springaling, full of confidence. "Jump on, Pippin, and you three," he went on, pointing at the last three Pips waiting in a line. "Now, Rusty, tickle my toes with that feather." Springaling wobbled and quivered and shook and shivered, and then he went ping, and the last four little apple Pips, all waving and blowing kisses, sailed through the hole in the shed roof into the lush green grass of the apple orchard. Rusty, Sprocket, and young Pinion stood for some moments just gazing up at the hatch of clear blue sky, before the man slapped a piece of plywood over the hole and hurriedly nailed it down. "Right, Fred, let the flipping wind blow it off this time if it can," he shouted, smiling. Rusty turned to thank Springaling for all his help, but he had already bounced away, singing a pretty little song that Wingsey said sounded rather like a nursery rhyme. As for the old spider, she just sighed and closed her eyes, mumbling, "Thank goodness for that." Rusty and Sprocket settled back into the deck chairs, feeling rather pleased with themselves. "That really was a stroke of genius, Sprocket," began Rusty, "thinking of a plan like that. No wonder you wanted to keep it a secret." "Well, you know how it is. I didn't want you all to think I was trying to be clever," replied Sprocket, in a matter-of-fact sort of voice. "After all, it was such a simple plan." "Oh, we would never do that, would we, Rusty?" interrupted Wingsey. "Think that you were clever, I mean." And they all laughed out loud. "But more to the point," shouted Wingsey, "what shall we have for supper?" "Not flipping apples again, I hope," blurted young Pinion.